Humanities 1302, and welcome to another lecture here in class. And today the topic that we're going to be covering is going to be that of the legacy of the 100 Years' War. Now, as we talked about the legacies of the conflict, there are a couple of things that I wanted to highlight on what we're going to be talking about, not so much with this conflict, but with future conflicts, because their historical impacts will be important, but largely what we're going to try to focus on is not only that, but also the impacts on society as well as on individuals. And a big theme for what we'll be talking about in this class will concern ideas such as history as well as memory, how they're going to historically choose to remember these conflicts. And the topic of memory, we're going to focus a lot more when we get to the French Revolution / Napoleonic era in the next unit. But I wanted to give a brief introduction over what the difference is between history and memory. Now, when we talk about history, in this class we talked about in our last video, the history of the 100 Years' War, we're using primary documentation from that time, interpreting that documentation, and therefore putting out a historical narrative, a reconstruction of events. However, historical memory is a little bit different than actual history. Memory is how a group collectively chooses to remember a particular event. And we'll talk about this a little bit today with the 100 Years' War, but we're going to especially see this when we talk about the French Revolution, how individuals choose to remember it, and so forth. And the issue with memory, and why it's not exactly history, is oftentimes you will see societies are going to blur out things that don't exactly look glamorous for that particular viewpoint. And so we'll be talking about this topic a lot in the future, and we'll talk a little bit about it in regards to literature today. But I wanted to outline that theme because we will see that collective memory in regards to the legacy of the conflict and how a group chooses to remember that conflict is going to be very important for how their societies will be constructed, how individuals are going to view politics, and so forth. But anyways, that's a topic more for the future. Today we're just going to be focusing on the effects of the 100 Years' War on the political front, the cultural front, as well as how it impacts literature, trying to create that historical memory that I talked about. Now first, what are the political ramifications of the 100 Years' War, specifically for the English, since that's who we've been focusing on for the last couple of weeks? Well, the historical ramifications of the 100 Years' War is it does lead to political instability in England. And most notably, we know this through the War of the Roses. Now, we had talked about it briefly during our 100 Years' War lecture. We saw how there was really a lot of changing of the guards, if you will, with the kings over in England. Most notably when we saw Richard II would be thrown out by eventually Henry IV. And with that change of power, as well as other events that take place during this period, there's a lot of question marks over which line in the royal family has the right, or should be the rightful heirs to the throne. And we start to see this develop really after the end of the 100 Years' War, moving into the 1450s and accelerating by the 1480s. Now, collectively, this civil war, if you will, that develops over in England will be known as the War of the Roses, but eventually it would end with the succession of, or I should say eventually with the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. But anyways, that's a topic for a completely other lecture, but we do see that it does lead to some major political ramifications for the royal family. Now, what about for average individuals? Now, they will be really centered in this fight in the War of the Roses, but the political ramifications of the 100 Years' War is going to center around the average Englishman. Especially as we move forward, what we're going to see is the legacies of, say, the Peasants' Revolt that came into being because of the extremely high cost of the 100 Years' War. They're going to continue to remain. Now, you will see a downfall of the feudalistic system within England, and throughout the 15th, 16th, and well up to the present day, there will be continuous reforms that really were brought into being because of the downfall of not only feudalism, but because of the efforts of the peasants during the Peasant Revolt. So there's another political impact that we also see happen because of the war. And this is going to multiply in its effect, and we'll see how it will eventually go over to France by the time we get to the late 1700s. But once again, that's a topic for another video. Now, there are a number of other political ramifications, but for the sake of this video, we just simply don't have enough time. But anyways, let's turn to some other aspects. Let's start talking about how it's going to impact literature, as well as how it's going to impact the soldier's experience, really the main focal point for our class. Now, first, I want to talk about the impact that this is going to have on individual soldiers that go out into conflicts in the future. Now, we had briefly touched on this in the previous video, But within the 100 Years' War, what we see, and it's probably the most significant change in regards to soldiering moving forward, will be changes in technology. Now, there have been a number of technological advances during this conflict, and there will be even more so, especially as we enter the Renaissance period, which really coincides with the end of the 100 Years' War. But the major technological advances that we do see during this conflict that changes warfare drastically and breaks down that old code of chivalry, that feudalistic style of warfare, would be gunpowder, would be cannons, would be muskets. Because now what this is going to do is change the nature of the battlefield. No longer would you see a lot of hand-to-hand fighting, and I understand there are archers, but remember, as a part of the code of chivalry, you would see hand-to-hand fighting between knight and knight. Moving forward, conflict is going to become much more impersonal. It'll be fought at ranges. We'll see, especially as we get to the Napoleonic era, the tactics are going to drastically change. And so that's going to change what it means to be a soldier and what that experience looks like in this conflict. And we'll talk about those changes as we get there next week. But also what we're going to see is that with these technological changes, which impact, I should point out, innovations in tactics, changing how armies fight, and so forth, also what's going to be a major impact for soldiers moving forward is no longer are we going to see really forced military service without any conscription, like you saw in the old feudalistic system. But rather, moving forward, you'll see more professional armies. You'll start to see, with those more professional armies, you'll start to see that they're going to be compensated, as well as you'll start to see alongside that they're going to be recruited in a much different fashion. And we'll start to see that take place during the 15th, 16th centuries as well, and really come into fruition by the time we get to the age of Napoleon. But anyways, once again, we'll be addressing that next week. But anyways, as we see this impact on what it means to be a soldier, let's also see how the war is going to impact specifically literature, especially how the English people are going to remember this conflict moving forward. Now, with the conclusion of the 100 Years' War, what it really is going to solidify within England is some of their true national stories. Prior to this, I mean, as we had seen before, Geoffrey Chaucer most notably, there really weren't a whole lot of English authors, and you see that really a lot of their national history had tied into that France. However, with the end of the 100 Years' War, you start to see a promotion of English literature. It becomes a respective literary form in its own right. And on top of that, you start to see the promotion of national myths. You start to see the promotion of national figures who had fought during the 100 Years' War to really promote, I don't want to say necessarily English nationalism, but at least some sort of form of patriotism. Now, this also impacts their collective memory of the conflict. And they would look on figures like Henry V in a lot of esteemed pride moving forward, whereas other kings that had failed during the 100 Years' War, Richard II as well as Henry VI, would be looked on in a more negative light. Now, where we see literature really demonstrate how the English people view the 100 Years' War and remember it is through the works of William Shakespeare that are published towards the end of the 1500s. Now, William Shakespeare's books, where we see the 100 Years' War represented, or I should say plays where they're represented, are pretty much in most of his plays about the English kings of this period. Now, he'll write a play about almost every single English king that we see during this period, from Richard III all the way to Henry VI. And the most noteworthy one that reflects the events of the 100 Years' War would be that of Henry V, which I actually have my copy here. Now, how Henry V is depicted in this play is very much how he's being depicted within English society. As we'd seen in the 100 Years' War, he was a very successful strategist and tactician out in the field. He had won the Battle of Agincourt, which we've read a ton about, as well as watched that documentary from last week. But anyways, he's going to be remembered in a very high light, especially in England. And you can see this represented within Henry V, which really tries to promote really a more positive view of warfare, and it really promotes the glories of conflict. And most noteworthy where you see this in Henry V, and y'all are going to be reading it this week, would be in his Band of Brothers speech, which really tries to connect the monarch, if you will, with average English people. And it would be a successful play, and it's still one, even up to this present day, where that same speech I just mentioned has been quoted time and time again. So we see the 100 Years' War lives long after its end date in 1453 within the English mindset. Now, in regards to the arts and how the 100 Years' War is going to impact artwork, directly, you will see during the conflict itself, especially around the time when we saw the Black Death, it would impact artwork by adding dark tones to paintings that were being produced during the period and so forth. And you'll also see that both England and France will produce tapestries as well as images of the conflict after the war. But in regards to its effect on the larger Renaissance movement that was beginning to develop around art during this period, it doesn't have a tremendous impact. You do start to see, because of the social upheaval events of the war, as well as also taking place across Europe, that there was really less of an interest in religious subjects and more of an interest within secular subjects. And increasingly you'll see that as you move forward through the centuries. But really that begins shortly after the 100 Years' War. But anyways, for us, that was just a brief video I wanted to do over the legacies of the 100 Years' War and how it will be remembered by the English people through plays like Henry V, as well as other mediums. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and end on this note. And as we end this video, just like always, make sure that you're going through all the lecture videos, all the readings from this week, any videos that are posted, as well as completing all assignments. But anyways, if you do have any questions, always feel free to reach out to me. But otherwise, everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see everybody in the next video.